Pippa, can I start?
Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, dear members and guests of SIRE Western Cape branch, and welcome to this afternoon's virtual event. And the well-known to us, Dr. Jan Erk, Professor Erk, on the Ethiopian Crisis, a subtitle, Understanding Federal Ethiopia and the Challenges of Managing Ethnic, Religious and Linguistic Diversity in the country. Most people know the headlines of these issues, starting with Ethiopia's fairly new Prime Minister, elected in 2018, Dr. Abiy Ahmed, who was rewarded with the Nobel Peace Prize, historically normalizing relations with Eritrea. But thereafter, by getting embroiled in a war with the Tigray People's Liberation Front. And we're going to hear a lot more than the headlines this evening from Dr. Erk. Now, Jan Erk has visited us twice before. He is currently the visiting professor at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Kumasi in Ghana. And in 2017, he was a Sire Bradley Fellow at WITS. So this is his third talk to our branch. The other talks have been more or less about issues in sub-Saharan Africa. And we are now going to move slightly to the north in this case. Professor Erk holds a PhD in political science from McGill University in Canada. He's held teaching positions at the University of Toronto, Central European University, and the University of Leiden. He's currently visiting professor at the School of Law and Governance in Addis Ababa University. That has been since 2012. He's the author of many books and treatises and articles. Professor Erk, it's a great pleasure to invite you to address us again. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. That was a very kind introduction. And also thank you for the members for inviting me again, and also for Pippa for organizing everything, and Martin for the steps that led here. Now, I know that Ethiopia has recently
Professor Erk, I think you should just say where you are.
I am at the moment in Kumasi. This is the second biggest city of Ghana, and it also happens to be the seat of the Ashanti Kingdom, and where the country's national House of Chiefs is situated. You might remember that one of the talks I'd given for SIA in the past was about traditional authorities and traditional structures. So while I'm here, there is another book in the makings about traditional kingdoms in Africa. But today, there is nothing about traditional kingdoms in my talk. It's going to be about Ethiopia and trying to understand this very diverse, very complex, but very informative country that puts the African experience in a very different light. I know that starting with the Nobel Peace Prize and the recent peace with Eritrea, the photogenic and young new leader of the country, Dr. Abiy, has put Ethiopia on the map. This was followed by discussions about the future of the Nile and the dam that is built on the Nile. But Ethiopia's relevance to regional and global politics, something that goes back to much earlier periods in human history. So what I want to do today is take a bird's eye view of the various political episodes the country has gone through, trying to understand why such diversity exists. At the moment, close to 80 official languages, 4 religions, and a very diverse geography, as well as demographic makeup. On top of everything, the diversity in Ethiopia we see between ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups is also one that is just beyond ethnic groups that happen to have minor differences. Sometimes the differences between the language groups are between language families. There is a Semitic language family group, an Omotic language family group, a Nilotic and Cushitic, and they're mutually unintelligible. On top of everything, there is still remnants of the traditional religions that have managed to survive in either Christian or Muslim form in terms of some of their rituals and ceremonies. So overall, this is a very diverse country. Now, one of the interesting things about Ethiopia is that it is also very poor when it comes to natural resources. There is no oil, there are no mineral resources, there is no gas. The country doesn't even have a port. So the last 10, 12 years of over 10% economic growth is therefore very interesting, particularly when we take into account the fact that the country lacks oil, it lacks gas, or any other resources that usually fuel quick and fast growth rates in the developing world. It also happens to have a very young population, estimated to be in the 90s, perhaps even closer to 100 million. And all of them have been experiencing the last 25 years under an imperfect form of a democratic order. Now, there are many examples of where Ethiopia deviates from the standards and expectations of a liberal democracy, but it is still a vibrant place where different opinions are expressed. And here, I have to also, in the start, highlight something that is particularly frustrating if you're new to the Ethiopian experience, but afterwards a little bit more, let's say, entertaining if you learn the ropes. And that is, there is a tradition of talking indirectly in Ethiopia. It is known, in fact, as wax and gold. It is a part of the culture of the Abyssinian Empire. Sanawak, as it's called in Amharic, was a symbol, a metaphor of during the processing of gold, the outward layer of wax is what appears, but hidden inside is the gold. And because Ethiopians have had numerous political repressive regimes in the past, there has been, it has become a national sport to express oneself in very coded messages. What looks as the wax, in fact, is what contains the gold within. So usually the research into how things evolve in Ethiopia requires a lot of decoding of the wax and getting to the gold at the heart of it. In a system where authoritarian politics have been prevalent, it is also a way for people to ensure that they could deny that they had criticized the government or the leaders. So what we have is a tradition of murky politics that goes back to imperial times. So if you're looking for clear answers, if you're looking for a subset of statistical sort of tables that show when and where and why ethnic conflict happened, then you'll be disappointed in the Ethiopian case. It is one of those cases that requires a lot of investment into the country's history, politics, and the coded meaning of various terms and references to history. What is also important to highlight here is that even those who oppose the government, those who have been dissenters, those who have fled abroad, those who have actively fought against the regime, there is a general sense of pride in the fact that Ethiopia was never colonized. There is a general sense of pride that the country can trace its royal lineage back to Solomonic times, to the marriage between King of Solomon and Queen of Sheba. Even if parts of this are an imagined history, it provides an important sense of respect, dignity, and pride when it comes to the country's politics. What also adds to the sense of national pride, not the flag waving and loud one, but the quieter and dignified one, let's say, is the fact that the Ethiopians defeated the wannabe colonists colonial powers, Italians, in a battle that took place towards the end of the 1800s. So altogether,
Jan, we've seized up.
here is a very diverse country where a lot of internal divisions exist from the Ethiopian experience in terms of how a country that lacks any natural resource, a country that lacks a port on the as a way to export and import, a country that has gone through famine and civil war, has managed to reach growth rates that are consistently above 10%. What is also interesting is that Ethiopians have managed to navigate their international politics with a great deal of sensitivity as well. I was teaching in Ethiopia the day that the prime minister before Dr. Abiy, Haile Mariam Desalegn, had resigned, and there is a fear that there was a power vacuum in Addis Ababa. The following day, both the Russian and the American ministers of foreign affairs or secretaries of state arrived in Addis Ababa to discuss things. Ethiopia has managed, also during the Cold War, to flirt both with the West and with the Soviet bloc, although the extent of that we will discuss a little later. So all in all, Ethiopia does not look like any other African country. It has differences that put it in a separate path. At the same time, there should be things we should learn from the Ethiopian experience of keeping close to 80 ethnic groups, areas below sea level or above 3,000 meters, dry, arid, lush and tropical, industrializing and fast-growing, or backwards and peripheral, all together within the confines of this very diverse country. Now, I think what should be a good reference point for us in order to understand Ethiopian history or Abyssinian imperial history is the Holy Roman Empire in Europe that was essentially the last bits disappeared before the armies of Napoleon. So what's the Holy Roman Empire represented was what the world looked like before the French Revolution and before the Industrial Revolution. So what we had in Ethiopia until the 19th century was this pre-modern feudal kingdom that lacked a strong centralized political and military center. So what we had, just like the kings and princes of Europe of earlier eras, was there was a sense of royal legitimacy, there was a sense of national unity, but the powers of the Ethiopian imperial state relied on a second set of feudal kings and princes in order to maintain its unity. So just like the Holy Roman Empire in Europe, this was a very diverse imperial union. Some were big and strong states, others were smaller ones. Some belonged to the ethnic groups that represented the original Abyssinian Highlander Semitic-speaking groups, essentially the Tigrayans, the Eritreans, and the Amhara who are fighting each other at the moment, versus the more African, sub-Saharan African communities elsewhere. Some were ruled as conquered territories directly by the crown. Some were within the realm of local princes and kings. Some were ruled by bishops or clergy. There was an unevenness, a sense of diversity when it came to the imperial order. And the role of the emperor was, of course, more than a figurehead, but not necessarily an absolute ruler who had control over every corner of the imperial system. Now, if we understand the dynamics of this pre-modern political entity, it becomes easier to understand why the country now has this high degree of diversity in languages and religions. In Europe, industrialization provided the nation state with the tools of nation building. Railroads, standardization of time and measurements, the national service, the centralization of bureaucracy, of tax collection, allowed the pre-modern kings of Europe to turn their countries into constitutional monarchies, speaking the same language, educating their kids in the same curriculum, and creating citizens. Whereas in the Ethiopian case, we don't have that infrastructural capacity. We don't have the same degree of industrialization. So what we have is the Holy Roman Empire before Napoleon's armies invaded. And this means that every corner has a different sense of its political identity, about its language, and also there are remnants of this imperial past, particularly remnants in the sense of settlers, imperial settlers who were sent to newly conquered land, mostly of the imperial highland stock, either as soldiers, as bureaucrats, or settlers. So this adds to the various tense daily issues that we encounter in Ethiopian politics nowadays. Now, what is very important to remember is that by the late 19th century, we have a period of modernization in Ethiopia. So the appearance of the imperial order remains, but the state, the modern state, is buying new arms and armaments, creating a standing army, trying to standardize tax collection, and also to weaken the powers of the princes, of the feudal lords, of the regional kings. So again, a bit like European history from an earlier time period, we have this process towards state consolidation, towards centralization. And the name Menelik II is very important here, because Menelik II, king or emperor Menelik II, is the one who incorporated the final bits of imperial territory into what is known as Ethiopia. And since then, most of the conflicts we see are between ethnic groups who join Ethiopia during this last wave and the centrist nation-building, state-building entity of Central Ethiopia. I'll save you the details of the royal lineage, but what happens is that eventually Menelik's daughter, Zeditu, becomes the empress. But her powers are essentially one of a facade, and the real power is in the hands of the regent, Lord Tafari. Ras, that is Lord in Amharic, Tafari. So the Caribbean Rastafarian movement actually takes its name from Lord Tafari Makkonen, who was eventually going to be crowned as Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. Under Emperor Haile Selassie, we see an increased level of consolidation, state building, modernization. It is about trying to build a standardized form of national identity, creating a bureaucratic military class, and using the imperial imagery, the history, the Solomonic dynasty, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, elements of state building. I should also warn you that I've been giving signals about internet signal being a little weak. So if I suddenly disappear, it's not because I decided to stop the talk, it's because of the internet. So let me, going back to Haile Selassie's reign, is this element of state building, nation building, but not through an idea of creating a popular.
You're frozen.
The empire, the emperor, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the Amharic script as the bastions of this new national identity. Okay, I have to wait, I guess. I don't know what else I could do. I hope it is okay now.
You're back. You're back. Thanks.
Perfect. So what we have is also very interesting in the post-Second World War context of Africa's decolonization and the Cold War. Because the country that I live in now, in Ghana, their leader, Kwame Nkrumah, represented a pan-African, left-leaning, sort of idealist, activist model of African.
You're
A little
freezing
bit
up
more
again.
conservative, less revolutionary, but equally proud of one's African heritage and identity. I'm so sorry about the internet. There is very little I could do other than waiting until I'm unfrozen again.
Jan, please
I think it's a
turn your videos off. Turn your videos off, both of you, and we can carry on like that.
Okay. So what we therefore have is starting with the 60s, all the way towards the early 70s, we have Ethiopia and the emperor representing a type of African independence that is closer to the Western Alliance, and others such as Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere representing a sort of a Pan-African, socialist-inspired third world liberation type of Africa. So right around that time, the elements that influenced every African country at that time also eventually get to influence Ethiopia, of course, and that is the young students' movements, particularly the revolutionary student movement, together with young officers, eventually manage to topple the regime. At that time, there is a video footage. I wonder if anyone has seen it, but young officers very unroyally bundling the emperor into the backseat of a Volkswagen Beetle and driving him off from the imperial palace. So what happened as an idealist takeover by young officers in the student movement, as it is the case almost everywhere, very soon degenerate into an episode of centralism, but this time not through the imperial path, but through the socialist military path. So you could see the map of Ethiopia and the diverse sort of regions. But if you add to that, the north is mountainous, the south and the west is tropical and lush green, and the east is desert, you could understand the pressures that a centralist military would have faced. So during this time, what is known as the Derg, the Amharic word for military committee, Derg, increasingly became nastier and heavy-handed and collectively punishing ethnic groups by forcefully settling them in places away from their ancestral lands. So this policy of divide and rule lasts for a few years, but it also guarantees that the regime has created enemies that will not rest until the Derg are toppled. So what you've been hearing in the news recently, TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, first makes a name for itself during the opposition to the Derg rule. They are the most successful activist militia from the region of Tigray, and they constantly attack and lead the war against the Derg regime. Their best allies are the Eritreans, right across from the border. You should also note that the Tigray language and the Eritrean language are almost identical, to the extent that if one does not say, it's hard for one to be able to conclusively determine whether one is Eritrean or Tigrayan. So it is these closely related two ethnic groups that are also behind the recent episode of war that we have seen. So what happens is that eventually, by the end of the 80s, it's pretty clear that the Derg regime's communist paymasters are no longer going to support the regime, and it's pretty clear that the day's numbered. So what we have in the early 90s is over 25 ethnic militias from all corners of Ethiopia, essentially all together, first liberate their regions, and they come to Addis Ababa to topple the regime. Between 1991 and 1995, we have this period of an uneasy power sharing between various ethnic elements that had fought against the military, the Derg. Eventually, the TPLF, under their very shrewd leader, Meles Zenawi, becomes the country's most powerful military force. They also establish satellite ethnic militia amongst the other groups that had fought the Derg regime. So the federal system we have in 1995 in Ethiopia is seen by some as the product of TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. Too small to dominate Ethiopia, only 7% of the population. Too powerful, but at the same time in need of a new idea of legitimacy for the new order. And federalism, ethnic federalism, in a very sort of pronounced way, becomes the new order. But you also have to remember that this ethnic federal system is also very much under the guidance and leadership of TPLF. So therefore, the last 2 years of what is happening in Ethiopia is particularly interesting for this reason. The TPLF was seen to be those who are welded to power and who dominate every aspect of new Ethiopia. Now they are a region under occupation by federal and Eritrean forces. So what happened was also a sign of the diverse politics and internal power struggles behind closed doors. While the Tigrayans are a very important group to understand how Ethiopian ethnic politics work, there are two other ethnic groups that we have to add to the picture in order to understand who the power brokers are. The Amhara are the traditional ruling classes. Amharic language is the historic language of the Abyssinian Empire. Ethiopian Orthodox Church is generally seen to be closely associated with the Amhara. The emperor, the symbols, the alphabet, everything is seen to be an imperial identity for the Amhara. The TPLF, the Tigrayans, are associated with the federal system. But demographically, these are small ethnic groups in comparison to the others in Ethiopia. The biggest ethnic, the most populous one, is the Oromo. The Oromo don't speak Semitic language. The Oromo were forcefully incorporated to the Abyssinian Empire. The Oromo, until recently, felt occupied by the Abyssinian highlanders. The Oromo mark their history as one of the dispossessed peoples, and yet they have now tasted the power.
Jan, I can't hear you. Hello, Jan.
Jan's still there. I can see he's still online. Let's just wait a few minutes.
I think he's frozen or something. Even with all our pictures off.
Okay, he's just gone out. He's just gone off. He's coming back in.
Great. Maybe Zoom meetings aren't that easy in Africa to the north of us.
Maybe everyone can type in their questions in the meantime while we're waiting for Professor Irk.
Yes, I can see that there are a number of busy typists if you look at the chat. Clearly the internet's not a bit tricky from Ghana. What can you see, Pippa? Can you see him coming back to us?
Not yet. Yeah. Maybe he's resetting his Wi-Fi. Just please hang in there, everyone.
So sorry about this interruption, but there we are. Well, I see our 98 participants are hanging in there still, and do hope Professor Irk makes it back.
A few people put up their hands. Maybe you can just type in the Q&A.
There'll be, yeah, I mean, we'll just allow Professor Irk to finish his address, which will be another 10 minutes maximum, I should think.
Okay, he's back.
Hi, glad to see you back from Ghana.
I'm sorry about this. This, unfortunately, we once in a while lose electricity, and that then influences the Wi-Fi connection.
Yeah.
My apologies. But I continue from where I left off.
Please do, Professor.
Right.
Have you got a rough idea of when you disappeared?
I do. I think it was about the change in the leadership of the country, 2018, if I remember
Just
correctly.
after you were talking about the Oromo.
The Oromo, the biggest ethnic group of the country, had been disenfranchised for a long while. And you also have to remember a very sensitive issue, and I think I'd mentioned Montreal and Brussels as examples of capital cities that have expanded into areas of traditionally other ethnic groups and the sensitivity that is associated with this. Addis Ababa is an Amharic-speaking city in an Oromo territory. Historically, it was established as the imperial capital in the highlands. And originally, its name was Finfinne, and it was an Oromo state. So every time Addis Ababa expands its municipal reach, it inevitably gets into conflict with the surrounding area of Oromo farmers. Again, one of those policies of expanding the economic zone of Addis Ababa sparked riots throughout the country. And the security services might have also been involved. There were a number of murky instances of grenades lobbed into demonstrations, panic, soldiers opening fire, and so on. So what we had was in 2018, there was a fear that the country was headed in a direction of civil unrest. Now, the entire country was ruled by one single party, Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, within which the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, is the most powerful. But the appearance is that an ethnic alliance, a coalition that has come together within this EPRDF framework. So within the party, they tried to replace Haile Mariam Desalegn, who comes from the Southern Nations and Nationalities and Peoples Regional State. That's really the name of that province. So behind closed doors, there was the expectation that the leader of the Oromo Regional State might assume prime ministerial position, quell the civil unrest. But completely accidentally, and behind closed doors, because Lema, who was leading the regional state, was not a member of parliament, they needed someone from that pro-government branch of the Oromo to take over. The expectation being the Oromo are going to see one of their own and say, okay, we see that the system recognizes that. So Dr. Abiy emerges at this very sort of strange moment, and he manages to appeal particularly to the young of the country. He promises a number of reforms. He invites dissidents back into the country. There is a period of liberalization. He completely unexpectedly reestablishes relations with Eritrea. And in the meantime, he changes the name of the party to Prosperity Party and kicks out the very founding member of this party, TPLF, from within the ranks of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. So what then happens is the sort of removal of what used to be a centrist party back to their regional bastion in the Tigrayan regional state. The COVID-19 starts. The Ethiopian government says they are going to postpone the elections. Tigrayan regional government says they are not going to postpone the elections. And they hold their elections. And they re-elect TPLF into regional governance. And it is then that we start seeing things that are probably going to be explored by historians about who attacked when, whether there was a federal military base that was attacked by TPLF, or whether Amhara militias attacked TPLF strongholds. There's going to be a lot of discussion about this, but essentially what happens is that there's an internal war, and the federal forces ask or allow Eritrean forces into Tigrayan region. You might remember I told you Tigrayans and Eritreans speak almost the same language. They have a lot of long historical links, but they are also bitter enemies. So the war between Eritrea and Ethiopia was very much seen as a war between Tigrayan-led Ethiopia and Eritrea. So atrocities are now being reported. The fact that Eritrean soldiers still control parts of Tigray wearing Ethiopian military uniforms is being reported. So what we are having now is arguably the most important turning point in Ethiopia since the fall of the Derg. What is going to emerge after this, no one knows. But what is happening is that what used to be the federal facade, the idea of ethnic federalism, a country that is made up of nations, nationalities, and peoples, is now going through a phase where Prime Minister and those close to the government are criticizing ethnic federalism. They're criticizing federalism for creating internal divisions and diversity, and they are now glorifying the imperial past, but rewriting it with Oromo national heroes in it. So what we're going to see is, unless things unravel again, is going to be yet another episode of centralization, or attempts at centralization, in Ethiopian national politics. And an important note to remember is that the OLF, the Oromo Liberation Front, who used to be the opposition and who played a big role in ushering in regime change, are increasingly voicing their opposition again. So I know that there are big issues. I know there are going to be disagreements over the precise details of which military came in where. And I don't know if there are any members of the Ethiopian or the Eritrean Foreign Service who are watching this who would want to represent the national point of view that they have been instructed to defend. But all in all, those details are only a very thin part of centuries long of unity and diversity and the Ethiopian state story. So I'll leave it here and I'll wait to hear from everyone else.
Thank you very much, Professor Irk. I mean, you're saying a lot about a country that I think very few of us know much about, except there do seem to be a few experts in the chat room. And a number of them seem to have disagreed with aspects of what you said. I wondered if I could just raise one or two points from the beginning. The whole issue of natural resources, you mentioned that there were none. Some in the chat room seem to disagree with that and question where this is and by whom this has been established. Then the second factual thing, perhaps you could clarify the growth rate of 4%. It's alleged in the chat room that the World Bank's estimate is different. Perhaps you could just deal with those couple of things. They were early on in your talk.
When one looks at the oil-producing countries such as Angola, Equatorial Guinea, when one takes into account natural gas, Mozambique, off the coast of Somaliland, when one takes into account mineral resources, coltan, copper from Zaire, Democratic Republic of Congo, and to a certain extent Zaire, there is nothing to that extent that dominates Ethiopian economic productivity. Agriculture seems to be the fastest growing area. Foreign companies, and this could be debated, and whether or not people are happy or unhappy with it is a matter of debate. But nothing that comes close, the natural gas of Mozambique, or the oil in Angola, or the coltan in Eastern Congo, is the case in Ethiopia. So some of the comments, I've seen that somebody amongst the participants call me a liar, but yes, I'm not lying.
They're getting very heated in the chat room.
Yes, no, I'm not a liar. So that is really the case. There is nothing that comes close to Angola or Mozambique or Eastern Congo, natural resources, things that usually fueled fast growth rates in the African continent do not exist in Ethiopia to a similar extent. The growth rate can differ between the World Bank and other sort of observations, but at a personal level, I could tell you this. The first time I went to teach in Addis Ababa, there were dusty streets with peasants bringing their produce into the market on donkeys. Now
when
there
was
is a
that?
light.
What year?
That was 2011. Now there's a light railroad, and people commute to work as if they've always commuted with a light railroad. So in that sense, the growth rate, I'm not saying that the wealth is equally distributed or shared. I'm not saying everyone is happy. I'm just saying that the economic growth rate, the indicators suggest that this is a fast-growing country. Now, where that wealth goes could be a completely separate issue to be discussed, but that's essentially the unique aspect of Ethiopia, especially for the rest of the continent, for us to understand, it is necessary to see that growth has also not followed the path that, say, we see in other places where cities grow and the regions decline. We've also seen the regional capitals undergoing a certain degree of growth that is unheard of in many parts of Ethiopia. From the recent capital of the Sidama region, Hawassa, to Dire Dawa in the north, I see that there are a number of these. But can I please ask the participants not to call me liars in the comments? I'm getting offended and it's not very nice. And the polite Ethiopians I know normally would not behave in such a disrespectful way.
Yeah, it seems to be what goes on in Ethiopia seems to cause sort of hot passions to arise in the chat room. I mean, clearly people feel very strongly about aspects. Can I just touch on a few issues? There was an interesting one, a question from somebody saying, isn't the problem in Ethiopia the sort of disconnect between the nationalist Amera state proponents and the, on the other hand, the regional autonomy proponents? Perhaps you'd like to expand on that.
That is one of the themes that one sees a lot in the literature and the debate, that there is a centralist and there is a federalist or decentralist sort of variance of Ethiopia. The reality is a lot more complex than this. Just to give you an example, Somali regional state was generally considered to be, there is an ethnic Somali regional state which is part of the Ethiopian Federation.
That's on the eastern side.
Yes,
on the eastern
bordering Somalia.
Yeah,
exactly. So they, for a long while, were considered somewhat not very centralist in their political loyalties, but recently they have become close allies of the center. So power struggles, interest, influence things. And also, who tends to be in power tends to like the center, and who tends to be sort of in the corridors of opposition tends to like decentralization. There are no fixed political identities of two camps of centralists and separatists that are essentially fighting each other. The TPLF were often considered to be those who had created strong center. Now they have been advocates and proponents of regional governance, even secession. So in that sense, it would be misleading to assume that there are fixed centralist and decentralist camps that do not overlap. The reality is a combination of a number of factors.
But Dr. Amir, what's his name? Abiy Ahmed,
yeah.
The Prime Minister, is presumably a centralist in his approach, a nationalist.
See, that is also.
Can you just give us an idea of how? Do you think he's there for a long time? I mean, does his approach, is it sustainable? His approach.
What Abiy Ahmed represents is in many ways a uniquely Ethiopian position, in the sense that he has both a Christian and Muslim lineage. He comes from the Oromo ethnic group, but he has also been a member of the system that was established under the guidance of TPLF. So he essentially has managed to appeal to every component, constituent line of division in Ethiopia. The wave that carried him to power was largely one of opposition. When I say opposition, you could also have opposition within the governing structure that wanted to assume power. But the behavior once in centralist inclinations. So we probably, it's too early to judge whether or not he's a centralist or a regionalist, but he managed to ride the regionalist wave and establish the centralist power. So we've got to see how things evolve. There are no easy answers in trying to understand such a diverse society, such a complex history, and multiple layers of interest that sometimes overlap and sometimes are mutually enforceable.
Could you indicate what's going on with the student movement? There's a question about the, what the progress of the student movement is now, which direction they're taking.
The student movement now, I'm afraid I don't know. It's at this very moment, I don't have any first-hand knowledge to say anything that brings a sense of order to what is happening. You have to remember that after the internal war and sort of the denial of media and aid agencies to travel to the region, there is a general atmosphere where not every opinion might be very openly voiced in the current climate.
Yes, can I just ask you, somebody questioned the point you made about the ethnic militia. I think you indicated there was possibly 25 different ethnic militia. Could you perhaps expand on that? Because it's been challenged in the chat room. Or questioned,
what has been challenged in the chat room? I don't know.
It's been questioned by
between 91 and 95, there were multiple, some might say 28, some might say 25, different ethnic militias fighting the Darg regime. Some of these were purely independent militias. Some were breakaways over differences in the interpretation of either Marxist or Maoist principles of revolution. Some were created deliberately to act as vehicles of other ethnic groups, communities. But what we have between 95 and 95 is these multiple ethnic militias have come together, but the most influential and powerful of them, TPLF, ended up determining the path of the country's future. The Eritreans, who had also fought the Darg regime, were the ones who decided not to join the new federal order with the subsequent war between Eritrea and Ethiopia in 1998.
Somebody asked, could you perhaps suggest solutions to this very complex situation in Ethiopia? How do you think it'll pan out? Or could it pan out positively for the country?
I think had there been easy questions, easy answers in this world, Aristotle and Plato would have found them long before I could venture into volunteering a perfect solution. The only thing I know is that there are no perfect solutions. Somebody's perfection is always a threat to somebody else's livelihood. So whatever solution is going to be ahead, it has to follow the path of the lowest common denominator, rule of law, democracy, individual liberties, but also collective recognition of the ethnic groups. I'm very suspicious of magic formulas that are presented as solutions to conflicts. It is a lot more complex and it has multiple angles to it. So it is also important perhaps to temper one's expectation that a magic formula is going to resolve things. It's a long slog, it's a lot of work, and it's not going to sort itself overnight.
Just to come back to Addis Ababa, the language is spoken there. I think you indicated it was in the Omoro area and that it was mostly Omoro was spoken. There's an indication in the chat room, somebody believes that 50 languages are spoken in Addis. I mean, is this correct?
There are, you see, officially the language number goes up as ethnic groups get recognition officially for their languages. So the number has been moving up from 70s into the high 70s. But there are also regional languages that only at the regional level are recognized as official languages. So, for example, in the Southern Nations, Nationalities and Peoples Regional State, at one point there were 56 such languages. The tricky thing is sometimes, just the same way Serbian, Croatian, and Bosnian were designated separate languages, although in reality in Ethiopia. Sometimes a different name is given to a dialect of another language. So linguists might disagree, but at the end of the day, what is important is that there are dozens of languages that are spoken in the country, and some of these come from different language families.
Would you like to say something more about the, I think it's 93, 94 Constitution? Somebody's raised that, because what it provides for is, it seems, more autonomy for regions. But would you like to comment on the fate of that Constitution and to what extent it's honored in the breach?
Sure. 1995 Constitution is an explicitly ethnic form of federalism that was accepted and seen as the path for the country. One of the key elements of that constitution is that it says that Ethiopia is made up of nations, nationalities, and peoples. It doesn't define who's a nation, who's a nationality, and who's a people. Partly because the ethnic diversity of Ethiopia meant that some groups saw themselves as nations, others as peoples, and so on and so forth. So this was more or less the constitutional bridgehead that allowed the ethnic element to enter federalism. There were nine regional states, now 10, and 2 chartered cities. But in addition to the 95 Constitution, we also have within the regional states, the possibility of establishing ethnic zones for administrative reasons. So what we have is a 2-level recognition of ethnic diversity. And one of the tricky issues is, of course, very rarely do people in this world live homogeneously in a compact land. Usually people live close by close. There are multiple claims to the same land. Histories of who arrived when could become very controversial. So what I had mentioned earlier on during imperial times of the imperial settlers, Highlanders who moved to regions in the west and the south, to this day become very sensitive issues. If one was forcefully settled there 5 generations ago, are they now considered indigenous, or are they considered as foreign, internal foreigners living in a regional state? Very sensitive issues, very difficult to find an answer to the satisfaction of both sides. As it is the case with deeply divisive issues that divide communities, the expectation that there will be an answer that would resolve this to the satisfaction of everyone, I think is unrealistic. Perhaps a good analogy here might be between those who believe in the sanctity of life and the woman's right to choose when it comes to abortion. The 2 groups are never going to come and reach a common point to the satisfaction of both sides. But what they could reach is a form of a modus vivendi, where they accept under what conditions would a woman have the right to carry out an abortion. So in that sense, it is not necessarily about resolving the ethnic conflict and finding a solution that is imposed on everyone. It is more about the acknowledgement that there are internal issues that might not be resolved. And the future lies in recognizing the way to not resolve, but manage the divisions in a way that ensures that both the collective rights of ethnic groups, as well as individual liberties, are protected and cherished in the soil.
Can I ask you, have certain ethnic groups established these regions within the 9 areas or 10?
Yes, there are ethnic zones within regional states. Some of these have been relatively straightforward. In other places, ethnic zones have created tensions precisely because about the claims, the borders, the story of who is indigenous to the land. Many regional state constitutions make sons of soil references to those who are indigenous to the particular land. And usually the highlanders are seen as settlers who do not benefit from the regional state's preferential policies. So there is an element that defies quick answers and solutions.
Thank you. And with all these languages, Professor Erk, is there a working language? Somebody asks in the chat room, is English the working language?
English has increasingly become the working language. One of the shortcomings of using English, as I saw in some of the rude comments that were directed at me, is that unable to express one's point of view in a way that captures nuances and degrees of complexity, it degenerates into a shallow yelling game as if teenagers were yelling at each other. The problem is when you do not have the proficiency to express complicated opinions, then the language, instead of becoming the common tool, can end up exacerbating the tensions and exaggerating the divisions. So English has become, but almost all Ethiopians also read Amharic alphabet. So historically, that used to be the lingua franca for the country.
How interesting. Well, you've obviously been keeping a good an eye on the chat in the chat room, Professor. Is there anything you'd like to highlight, perhaps, in response to some of the things you've noticed?
There are so many, and some of them were very shallow and emotional. So I don't know which ones deserve a reply.
Let's stick to the sensible comments.
Okay. Ethiopia does not have easy answers, but at the same time, one has to look at this as an example of an African attempt to find African solutions to an African problem where no one from the outside will come and tell you about how to organize your state, when to have your elections, compared to what is happening in South Sudan, in Somalia, in Central African Republic. The best part of the Ethiopian example is the fact that Ethiopians themselves are debating and discussing these issues. What is also a very important element to highlight here is that almost everyone feels like a minority in Ethiopia now. Let me unpack what I mean. The Amhara are the traditional part of the Abyssinian imperial history, and culturally they have given a lot to what is Ethiopia now. But they feel that they are removed from corridors of power in their regional state. The Tigrayans that used to dominate Ethiopian politics are now in a regional state and they're occupied by federal forces and they feel disenfranchised. The Oromo, who are over 35 million, biggest ethnic group in Ethiopia, feel that their political power is not matched by their economic and social influence in the country. So everyone feels that the existing political and economic order is not giving the people they represent its due. So in that sense, it creates a permanent sense of dissatisfaction, but the fact that no one dominates, that there are multiple groups, that there are multiple lines of cleavage and division and loyalties, in a strange way ensures stability. Yes, you're going to say, maybe it doesn't look like stability. Things are not happy. There are uprisings, riots, and tension, but it is not a failed state of militias fighting each other. It is not what Somalia was like in the 90s. So in that sense, we have to remember that what is happening in Ethiopia is not going to have an easy answer. The entire history points out in this direction, but Ethiopians of every political color, of every ethnic origin, I think should feel proud that whatever happens to Ethiopia, it is going to be an Ethiopian solution to an Ethiopian problem.
Thank you. Maybe there's time for just one last question, Professor Earp. I see Hopeful Radebe has asked, is there a possibility that Eritrea wants to expand its territory and therefore takes part in these ethnic tensions in Ethiopia?
I think that there are a lot of uncertain elements, and I could only provide a guess about where things are headed. I think during the internal war in Tigray, Eritrean forces benefited from their close contact that they had established after Dr. Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afewerki had established bonds. There might also be possibilities that in a unique constitutional arrangement, Eritrea might join the confederation with Ethiopia. Historically, there was in 1952 a federation of Ethiopia and Eritrea. So a sort of an asymmetrical union would be could be established. But what is also important is that we have to add strange and unique relationship Somaliland region has with its bordering parts. Somaliland is technically part of Somalia, but close links economically to politics in Ethiopia. And also Djibouti, which is also an important player. There could be attempts to think, debate, negotiate a certain confederal union that brings back Eritrea into a looser form of a federal union and allow Ethiopia access to the ports.
Yeah.
We don't know, and we don't know how things are going to evolve, but there are many, many players, many, many dynamics. And also, when you have too many players and too many dynamics, sometimes accidents can also have huge political consequences.
Yes. I see there are quite a few further good questions in the chat room. Could I just raise one of them here?
Sure.
What about Chinese involvement in Ethiopia?
Like everywhere in the continent, the economic influence of China in Ethiopia has been a big element of economic growth, particularly when it comes to infrastructure projects. Now, the Chinese involvement throughout the continent exists everywhere, from Tanzania to Mozambique to Angola. So what is perhaps important to note is that, yes, there is influence, but this is offset by also Ethiopia's traditional links to the Western world and also to the United Arab Emirates, to India, and so on and so forth. So yes, they are, but they are not the dominant player.
Is there a dominant player from a point of view of a foreign investor?
No one so far.
Well, it's more or less, there doesn't seem to be any dominant player in any area of activity.
I think the tension with Sudan and Egypt over the dam is forcing the country's traditional allies to pick sides, but there are also new players who are benefiting from the economic structure. Turkey is one of the sort of big economic investors, particularly when it comes to textile. United Arab Emirates is especially influential in Eritrea. Indian agriculture companies have been establishing huge farms in some of the country's western regions. Dutch flower growers are establishing themselves in the outskirts of Addis Ababa. Huge, massive greenhouses take place, are constructed across the land. Chinese, especially leather and shoe industry, is making big investments. So it is one of those cases where the country managed to avoid putting all eggs in one basket in the form of one natural resource, oil, petrol, gas, or minerals, which has created its own set of problems, particularly when it comes to how these big companies and big but one of the benefits of this diverse economic, one of the benefits of not putting all your eggs in one basket is that it allows a diverse sort of response to the changing dynamics in world economic and political issues. Ethiopia's influence in Somalia, in next door South Sudan, are a big part of Ethiopian politics, no matter who is in power. So it's not about who is in the corridors of power in Ethiopia now. It's a natural outcome of regional politics.
There are lots of good and interesting questions in the chat room, in the Q&A, Professor Erk, but I don't have them all in front of me. Is there anything you'd like to pick out and respond to, or shall I think this is the last one, definitely the last one. Is there something else you'd like to particularly emphasize or respond to?
There are a few questions that I see asking me about details about the name of the last Amhara ruler of Ethiopia and so on. I think in general, one of the big risks is when one builds a picture of one's country, the different types of information, evidence can create different interpretations about who are the guys and good guys and who are the bad guys. But essentially, when as a foreigner I look at Ethiopia, is in addition to all the troubles the country has gone through, the fact that it has by itself managed and decided to deal with its own issues is a big plus. I think Ethiopians, in addition to discussing the big challenges and issues facing them, should also acknowledge how influential they are to other parts of Africa, as setting an example of an African country that has never been colonized, as an example to be emulated by the Caribbean, the West African countries. So in that sense, of course, it's always possible to discuss the problems and to seek answers, but two things: there are no perfect answers, and one's sense of perfection is offensive to your neighbor. So I think one should seek a lowest common denominator type of a solution to these divisions, and to assume that maybe nobody has the monopoly over having the right story about what real Ethiopia is.
Well, Professor Erk, it's been a fascinating talk. Incredibly complex country. You seem to have a pretty firm grip on the issues, in spite of the complexities that you've had to deal with. And I can only thank you for enlightening us in this way. I've learned so much, and I must say, I'm sure I speak for the other participants from your talk about a country that has always seemed a sort of attractive, distant place, but clearly very, very complex and very interesting indeed. So yeah, they seem to be going through a bit of a difficult patch with the Tigray issue, but I think you've managed to put that in perspective for us in terms of the bigger picture that affects Ethiopia. So I want to thank you very much for your presence here today. It's been a pleasure and a great privilege to host you. Thank you so much.
You're very kind, Sheila. And thank you to everyone as well. And thank you again for the invitation. It was my pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you. All the best. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, Sheila and Jan.
Thank you, Pippa. Thank you, Sarah. Sarah.